Okay, we are live streaming. Ayla, you may want to put your things in a second. Okay, I'm going to start.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I have the honor of hosting tonight. I am Kayla Jacobs, the Youth Mobilization Program Manager for the Catholic Climate Covenant. Thank you all for joining us today. We need to share some important information for our Spanish language attendees, so I'm going to pass it over to Paz.
Thank you, Kayla. And if you could forward the slide, please. Thanks. This information is for the Spanish audience. Mi nombre es Paz Artaza Regan y soy la gerente de programa de la Alianza Católica para el Clima. Les doy la bienvenida a todos los participantes que hablan español. Esta información es toda para ustedes. Si están participando en este evento a través de la transmisión en vivo en YouTube, no tendrán acceso a la interpretación simultánea en español. La interpretación solo funciona si están participando a través de Zoom. Incluiremos la grabación de la interpretación en español con el correo electrónico que les mandaremos mañana. ¿Cómo escuchar la interpretación? En los controles, vayan abajo y busquen donde diga interpretación. Haga clic allí. Busque el idioma que quiere, español, Spanish, y haga clic en él. Para escuchar el idioma interpretado solamente, haga clic en el Mute Original Audio. Y eso es importante para no escuchar ambas en inglés y en español. Si necesitan ayuda, manden un mensaje en la caja que dice Q&A, preguntas, respuestas. Si están en YouTube, tendrán que mandar un mensaje a Dan Misla en catholicclimatecovenant.org. Dan Misla, y vamos a darles en otras de las slides el nombre. Y ahora de vuelta a Kayla. Kayla, all for you.
Okay, so before we get started, we have some housekeeping information. This session is being recorded and a link will be sent to everyone who registered within a day or so. If you are on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching the live stream on our YouTube channel, you can email your questions to Dan Misla at catholicclimatecovenant.org, as you see it there on the screen. The chat is available to chat with others attending the session. We request that everyone use the chat for good and be respectful to everyone. You won't be able to save the chat. And remember to submit your questions via the Q&A box, not the chat box, or we will probably miss the question. And now let us pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God, maker of marvels, you weave the planet and all its creatures together in kinship. Your unifying love is revealed in the interdependence of relationships. and the complex world that you have made. Save us from the illusion that humankind is separate and alone, and join us in communion with all inhabitants of the universe. Through Jesus Christ, our Redeemer, who topples the dividing walls by the power of your Holy Spirit, and who lives and reigns with you forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Again, welcome everybody. This is a biannual conference series, Laudato Si and the U.S. Catholic Church. It is co-sponsored by Creighton University and Catholic Climate Covenant to equip and inspire Catholics to more deeply integrate Laudato Si and its creation care teachings in the U.S. Church. In the last of the three-part series, we are focusing on the 7 goals of the Laudato Si action platform to encourage a greater understanding of the platform's goals: response to the cry of the poor, ecological economics, adoption of sustainable lifestyle, ecological education, ecological spirituality, community resilience and empowerment, and response to the cry of the earth, and to encourage Catholic individuals and groups to enroll in the platform, providing us all with a clearer path for accomplishing each goal. In addition, Catholic Climate Covenant is coordinating the Laudato Si action platform in the U.S. Catholic Church through its God's Planet initiative, and Creighton University is a platform signatory. We invite you to visit this website, godsplanet.us, as you see it here on the screen, as you explore ways to engage with the Laudato Si action platform. Now moving on to our topic tonight, response to the cry of the earth. As defined by the Laudato Si action platform, the response to the cry of the earth is a call to protect our common home for the well-being of all, as we equitably address the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and ecological sustainability. Actions could include the adoption of renewable energies and energy sufficiency measures, achieving carbon neutrality, protecting biodiversity, promoting sustainable agriculture, and guaranteeing access to clean water for all. And tonight we will hear from 3 excellent panelists, and I will introduce them now. First, we have Carlos Martinez, PhD, Earth Science at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Dr. Martinez is an expert in climate variability and change. In the American Meteorological Society, he developed and chairs the Committee on Spiritual Multi-Faith Outreach in Science. He has worked to build relationships and connections between multi-faith and Indigenous organizations and the Weather, Water, and Climate Enterprise on environmentalism, with a steadfast commitment to increase representation and engagement with underserved voices in communities when tackling environmental issues. Dr. Martinez has earned his PhD in Earth and Environmental Science from Columbia University. We will also be hearing a video from Dr. Dan DeLeo, Associate Professor and Director of the Justice and Peace Studies program at Creighton University. Dr. DeLeo teaches and researches on Catholic social teaching, climate change, and Laudato Si. He co-authored U.S. Catholic Bishops' Silence and Denialism on Climate Change, edited All Creation is Connected, Voices in Response to Pope Francis's encyclical on ecology, and has published articles in the Journal of Moral Theology, Journal of Catholic Social Thought, and Journal on Religion and Society. Since 2009, Dr. DeLeo has been a consultant with the Catholic Climate Covenant. He earned his PhD in Theological Ethics with the minor in Systematic Theology from Boston College. And we also have Deacon Kent Ferris, OFS, Director of Social Action and Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Davenport, Iowa. Deacon Ferris is a secular Franciscan and has served as Director of Social Action in the Diocese of Davenport since 2009. In this capacity, Deacon Ferris leads the diocese's work to implement the Laudato Si action platform. As part of his work, he is coordinating the discernment of a diocesan commitment to net zero carbon. Deacon Ferris has spoken nationally about Laudato Si and served on the board of directors of the Roundtable Association of Catholic Diocesan Social Action. He holds a master's degree in counseling and college student personnel from Minnesota State University, Mankato, and a master's degree in pastoral ministry from St. Ambrose University. Again, thank you all for being here, and Dr. Martinez, you can get us started.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, and to the Catholic Climate Covenant for inviting me here to speak on really the scientific perspective responding to this cry. And so I'll pull up my PowerPoint slides here. I hope you can see it. If not, let me know. But yes, so again, my name is Carlos Martinez. I'm a climate scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and I will be providing more scientific perspectives on Mother Earth's cry. So I want to begin with this beautiful image that you can find online through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And this is an image of our planet Earth, a beautiful image that I was able to look at from 2 days ago. You probably could find your house from there, maybe. But what you find is these beautiful, intricate, and just phenomenal complexities of our Earth climate system. The clouds, the air, the sea, the waters, the mountains, the vegetation, all of these things are things that we value, that we instill, that we hold day to day in our lives when we decide, what clothes to wear, what outdoor activities to do. And I, as a climate scientist, love to look at this image often because it really motivates me and gives me so much awe in what God has provided for all of us, and getting to, kind of pick his brains as to how he created our beautiful planet. And it's through these images and others that really captivated my desire to be a climate scientist, an atmospheric scientist. So I'll go really briefly as to my journey in this beautiful life that I am so thankful to live in and study with this planet. So I was born in Puerto Rico, in Caguas, the mountainous portion of the island, where at that point in time, we had approximately 360 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That is the metric that we use to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And my family, we moved to the mainland where I grew up in Dallas, Texas, where I really enjoyed the 1 inch of snow that would fall that would close down the entire metroplex, but also the severe weather patterns and other things that made me really captivated as to how the Earth works. And so I pursued a degree in meteorology at Texas A&M University, where at that point we were almost at 400 parts per million. And it was actually during this time where I did a research experience here in Boulder, Colorado at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And that's actually when Laudato Si was released. And I remember printing the entire thing because I was deeply, deeply just motivated and interested. And it's one of the most powerful documents I've ever seen that beautifully weaves scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledges, and theology, morals, and ethics on environmentalism. And that's, I think, because there's a lot of synergy with these different knowledge systems that a lot of us hold dearly. And so this was a huge catalyst for me, not only as a Catholic, but as a scientist who subscribes to a faith. And I wanted to do research, seeing the impacts of climate change in many communities, including my own in Puerto Rico. And so I pursued my PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences, had such an enriching experience learning research, but it was also during that time where I saw the impacts of Hurricane Maria on my grandparents when they experienced 135 days without power, the impacts of, my colleagues experiencing the impacts of climate change in their neighborhoods. And even here in Boulder, Colorado, where we recently have had wildfires one of which that was at my workplace, very close to it, last year hit over 1,000 homes in the Front Range, Colorado area, the issue with snowmelt and other things. And so that has really catalyzed my story in hearing the cry of our Mother Earth. And so that's what I will be sharing here, in addition to my story. What are we seeing in terms of the science as to when listening to this cry? So the first image I will share with you all is the amount of temperature that has increased since 1850, or the pre-industrial record. And right now, or back, in 2020, we were at about 1.25 degrees, and that's probably a little bit higher now, probably 1.3 degrees above normal, above the prehistorical record. And we expect to reach the 1.5 degree mark that the Paris Climate Accord was benchmarking by 10 years from now, about approximately, 8 to 12 years or so. And so that's really revealing, right? And what are the impacts for a 1.5 degree scenario? Well, this is what the response will be in the mother's cry, most likely, is that under a 1.5 degree scenario, we expect to have extreme heat at least once every 5 years in 14% of the world. We expect coral reefs to have bleaching in 70 to 90% of the coral reefs around the world. We expect sea ice that is free in the Arctic during the summers, which hasn't happened in millennia. And we also expect many inland species to become extinct because of the added stressors that climate change will have on several ecosystems and biodiversity. And that's under a 1.5 degree scenario. Under a 2 degree, as you can see, we see things that are 2 to 10 times worse. And we're already seeing the impacts now. You don't have to look at these graphs and charts to know that the Southwest, with the dry conditions there, that we've seen recently, the extreme heat that we've seen in parts of the United States, and in the Northeast, the flooding events that we've seen, 100 degree waters near the Key West. I mean, the impacts are right now. Climate change is happening right now. And when we look at what the targets are being made with respect to the government, through COP, through the United Nations, the current policies and actions have us reaching well above 2 degrees scenario towards the mid and later part of this century to 2.7. And under the current pledges, we will reach 2 degrees Celsius. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. And so let's talk more about the United States, given that this is our audience, and the relevance of what we're seeing in science in different parts of the continental US and across different islands in Alaska and Hawaii as well. So let's begin with the Northeast in New England. This is, again, another graphic from NOAA. What we have already seen is 0 to 2 feet rise in sea level. And that's big. That's very important for many coastal areas. We're already seeing many communities adapting and mitigating to these effects, and we expect to have an increase in sea level throughout this century. When we look at the number of 90-degree days per year in the Northeast, we expect to have triple what are the number of days that we have now. So for example, across the Northeast, you have anywhere from 10 to 30 or so days. We expect that to increase from around 40 to 70 days by mid-century. And that's really significant for an area where, AC ventilation, that's not as widespread as, where I lived in Texas. And you feel it with the humidity. And so heat-related stress and illnesses could likely increase in the future with result to climate change in this area. Now I want to shift gears to the Southeast, and this is an image, a satellite image in the Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana, and this is between 1963 and 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And this shows you what's happening in coastal areas across the US, but especially in the Delta of Louisiana, where sea level rise has rapidly increased in this region, which has really hit hard the indigenous communities that have lived in these areas for years, for decades, hundreds of years, and they have to leave. They have to leave their home as a result of sea level rise. We see this vulnerability across the entire Southeast, where we see very high threat from sea level rise in this region. And if we look at, again, looking at temperature increases, the number of days that are going to be at or above 95 degrees, we see a huge shift, anywhere from what was 15 to 30. Now we're getting into 60 to over 75 days, and with heat index values that could very well be above 100 to 110 degrees in this region because of the humidity. We also see an issue with water availability in this region. We project that there will be a dry trend across most of the southeastern United States, which is going to impact farming, local fisheries, coastal communities as well, because the atmosphere is able to hold more water. It's like a sponge where when you warm the atmosphere, it has more space to hold more water vapor. And then, so what you get is a long dry spell. And then when it's ready to precipitate, it's a huge flash flood event, intense rainfall following these dry spells. And that's what we are likely to see in many parts of the United States. Thinking of dry conditions, speaking of, in the Western US, snowpack is one of the most important water sources for the Western United States. And what this shows is each state's contribution to snowpack. So that's why the bars are the longest in Colorado, and the changes over time. And so for Colorado, for instance, you're going to have approximately a quarter less than what we have today or in this time period. And similarly in California too, you will have half of what you normally get by the end of this century. And that's really important for rivers, for lakes, many of which rely so heavily on snow melt in this region. And so Lake Powell, for example, they expect a continual decline. Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and others, a huge resource for many communities, especially in Phoenix and Las Vegas and other areas. We expect the dryness to continue on. Even if we have what we had this past winter, we expect, looking in terms of climate, this continuation. And this can lead as well to wildfires. So this graph shows the percent increase of weeks with conditions that are favorable for very large fires. And we see this primarily in the Southwest and in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest as well, where you will have 2 to 5 more weeks than what you normally would have for these extreme wildfire events, which we have already seen here in the US and in Canada as well. Shifting gears to Hawaii, again, sea level rise is going to be a huge issue here, as there is not a lot of land space in this area. So a lot of the developing parts of Hawaii and Oahu, for example, are in the coastline areas. We expect numerous and significant potential structural and economic losses from changes to sea level rise in this region. And in Alaska, with permafrost that's thawing where many towns are based, that insulates a lot of the decayed material in this region. And so that's going to have increased exposure to what is beneath permafrost as it thaws, as well as over these coastal areas that are next to sea ice with local fishing. We have already seen major impacts from climate change in these local indigenous communities who rely on the local resources. And this is just a very clear image, which you can find anywhere where you look at time lapses of glaciers. We see a complete reduction of many glaciers, hugely impacting ecosystems in many areas. And so I want to, talk about the response, specifically the response in the science, because the scientific community, graphs and charts can only go so far. And so there's been a lot of discussion on climate science communication. How can we befriend our communities? Since approximately 20% of US Americans are friends with scientists, and 44% of them know or have met a scientist. And so this really catalyzed my desire to develop a committee within the American Meteorological Society, which has about 11,000 members with broadcast meteorologists, National Weather Service persons, scientists, academics, people like myself, right, who are Catholic or who are of other faith traditions, who are Indigenous, who see with both the Western science lens and their faith lens. And that's what Cosmos brings. Cosmos really brings the universe together with these different ways of understanding the universe, the world, right, in a way that focuses on environmentalism. And so we do a lot of really awesome activities within a professional society, which is very unique. We have webinars that bring in spiritual leaders from various backgrounds to come and talk about how spiritual and faith-based communities and knowledges are valuable for the weather, water, climate community. We have sessions at the American Meteorological Society annual meeting to talk about these issues. We work and partner with universities as well on mental health, on eco-anxiety, climate grief, whether or not you subscribe to a faith. You may use meditative or ways to process, which faith knowledges do so brilliantly when we talk about suffering, when we talk about grief and other things. And so that's another way we are partnering. We also partner with multi-faith organizations like Green Faith, Interfaith Power and Light, the Catholic Climate Covenant. With their Homemakers program, we provided scientific expertise for their curriculum with young adults. And then some ways for you to plug into the weather, water, climate community. The National Weather Service has this program called Weather Ready Nation, where they partner with houses of worship on environmentalism, for example, providing weather radios, providing personnel that you could get in touch with if you have a question on building a more green infrastructure in your local house of worship, educational resources on being storm ready against tornadoes, wildfires, hurricanes, and mitigation practices against climate change as well. We have also, if you work with Indigenous communities, here at NCAR, the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Science, which Cosmos partners with, where we work with other systems of knowing in Western science to have an intercultural approach at addressing weather extremes. And then lastly, we have several federal agencies, as you may know, for example, the Department of Homeland Security with FEMA, the Department of Commerce. They have grant programs that faith-based communities can apply regarding disaster resilience and preparedness. They also can leverage emergency management tools, experts, and resources to ensure faith communities are ready as well. And so this is what the scientific community is doing. We have over 50 members. You don't have to be a member of the American Meteorological Society to be a part of Cosmos. If your organization is interested in learning more, feel free to contact me, as we want to really be a facilitator of dialogue and connect you with the weather, water, climate community, with local experts in your community that are able to provide you the guidance that is needed for your storytelling, for the impacts that you are seeing in your local neighborhoods. And so the last thing I want to share is just going and bringing us back to this image and just this phrase I like to say is, your story matters. Like the storytelling that I had with my family in Puerto Rico and the experiences that they've had with climate change, your story in your local neighborhood, in your community, in your house of worship matters absolutely. Because you live in this planet, you have the responsibility and the authority to make change. So don't be discouraged. You don't have to be a climate scientist. The science can help guide you and provide the tools, which is the goal. But at the end of the day, if you want to persuade or influence your local politicians, your neighbors, many faith communities, some can be skeptical or apathetic to these issues. I know for a fact, just from my own experience, that they will be more persuaded by you than me, because they know you, they trust you, they understand better where you're coming from. It's that ethos. And I believe that will galvanize our communities across this country in a multi-faith manner, and with your neighbors and other stakeholders to do the work that is needed against climate change. And so with that, thank you again. Happy to take questions later at this during the Q&A portion, and just again really appreciate your time in listening to the scientific perspectives on our Mother's Cry. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Martinez. We will now watch a video from Dr. DeLeo, and also a reminder to continue to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address those questions towards the end of the session.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for understanding my need to present by recording. As you know, this session focuses on the Laudato Si Action Platform goal, Response to the Cry of the Earth. On the platform website, the Vatican describes that to reach this goal, actions could include the adoption of renewable energies, energy efficiency measures, and achieving carbon neutrality. Tonight, I'll focus my remarks on the theological foundations of these actions. In particular, I'll consider them within the parishes and diocese sector of the platform, and focus specifically on dioceses. To begin, I want to revisit our conference opening keynote by Christiana Figueres, former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. During her remarks, Ms. Figueres challenged the U.S. Catholic Church to commit to net zero emissions. As NCR captures in this article, Ms. Figueres declared the U.S. Catholic Church can and should commit to zero emissions by 2040 as an institution. The story also describes that when Dan Misla, founder of Catholic Climate Covenant and moderator of the event, noted that the U.S. Church alone owns upwards of 100,000 buildings that can enact the Church's own climate change teaching, Figueres enthusiastically replied, "Hey, potential." I begin with this story because I think she's right. The U.S. Catholic Church has great potential, I would say extraordinary potential, to live its own climate change teaching across our vast network of buildings. But I also begin with this because I think there's even more to Ms. Figueres' challenge. Specifically, I want to argue that in light of Catholic teaching, diocesan commitments to science-based greenhouse gas reductions are a matter of mission fidelity, a particular responsibility of bishops, and an opportunity to catalyze both external social justice and the new evangelization, especially among youth and young adults. To understand diocesan commitments to science-based greenhouse gas reduction policies as a matter of mission fidelity, we need to outline Catholic ecclesiology and missiology. The term ecclesiology comes from the Greek ekklesia for assembly and means study of the church. The term missiology comes from the Latin missio, meaning mission, and means study of the church's mission. According to the Second Vatican Council's document, Lumen Gentium, the church is the people of God, all the baptized. Among this people, the law is the new commandment to love one another as God loves us. In Catholic moral theology, love entails willing and acting for the good understood as flourishing. Love is also synonymous with biblical justice, a point that we'll soon see is especially important. The Church describes that the mission of the people of God is to spread among all peoples the kingdom of Christ and of God, and to be on earth the initial budding forth of that kingdom. At this point, it's crucial to recognize that the kingdom is defined by clear norms. Namely, it is a kingdom of truth and life, a kingdom of holiness and grace, a kingdom of justice, love, and peace. Moreover, Pope Francis helps us understand that the Church's mission requires caring for our common home. As he quotes the Bolivian bishops, peace and justice, essential aspects of the kingdom, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes which cannot be separated and treated individually. Putting all this together, the Church's mission is to build this kind of world here and now, to advance and embody God's kingdom, as we say in the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven. To do that, the means of the Church's missionary activity is evangelization. Here, the Church's definition of evangelization is crucial. Evangelization is announcing of Christ by a living testimony, as well as by the spoken word. In other words, evangelization requires the Church to live its teaching, as we saw above with respect to mission, to be on earth the initial budding forth of that kingdom. In light of the church's teaching, we can summarily say that the church's mission is to build and embody God's kingdom through evangelization of acting and speaking. More formally, we can cite the 1971 World Synod of Bishops document Justitia in Mundo. Action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension, an essential dimension of the preaching of the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission. Now, when the church speaks about justice here, it's referring to biblical justice. To understand this term, we can turn to the U.S. Bishops' document, Economic Justice for All, in which they write, "Biblical justice is the goal we strive for. This rich biblical understanding portrays a just society as one marked by the fullness of love, compassion, holiness, and peace. In other words, biblical justice is synonymous with God's kingdom. On their path through history, however, sinful human beings need more specific guidance on how to move toward the realization of this great vision of God's kingdom. This guidance is contained in the norms of basic or minimal justice. These norms state the minimum levels of mutual care and respect that all persons owe to each other in an imperfect world. Catholic social teaching, like much philosophical reflection, distinguishes three dimensions of basic justice: commutative justice, distributive justice, and social justice. In light of the bishop's teaching, we can summarize that social justice is a pathway to biblical justice, which is essential to the church's mission. In order to appreciate the implications of this teaching, we need to define social justice. In the Catholic tradition, social justice concerns the social, political, and economic aspects, and above all, the structural dimension of problems and their respective solutions. As the U.S. bishops describe, social justice entails work to address the root causes of problems facing our communities by advocating for just public policies and helping to change the social structures that contribute to suffering and injustice. Here, I want to emphasize a point that will be especially important in a few minutes. Social justice through advocacy works to reform any social structure, including within the structure of the church. So in light of all these teachings from the church, we can conclude that action on behalf of social justice is essential to the church's mission. But we can go further. Recall that justice is essentially connected to creation care. As Pope Francis quotes the Bolivian bishops in Laudato Si, peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are three absolutely interconnected themes which cannot be separated and treated individually. Additionally, we can remember the teaching from St. John Paul II that Christians in particular realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith. Combining these insights, we can thus say that action on behalf of environmental social justice is essential to the church's mission. But even here we can go further. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines faith as an adequate response to this invitation of God's love. This notion of adequate response is in a sense what St. Thomas Aquinas means when he defines the virtue of prudence as right reason applied to action. In other words, prudence adequately responds to God's love by acting in light of reasoned information. In the context of the climate crisis, an adequate response that is prudent responds to God's love in ways guided by the best available science. And this is, in fact, what the U.S. bishops stressed in their 2001 pastoral letter titled Global Climate Change, a Plea for Dialogue, Prudence, and the Common Good. So putting all this church teaching together and borrowing from the title of the book by Michael and Ken Himes, we can conclude that prudent action on behalf of climate social justice is essential to the church's mission and the fullness of faith. This call for prudent climate social justice is what Pope Francis emphasizes in Laudato Si. He writes, there is an urgent need to develop policies so that in the next few years, the emission of carbon dioxide and other highly polluting gases can be drastically reduced, for example, substituting for fossil fuels and developing sources of renewable energy. Here, I think it's important to emphasize that in calling for urgent climate action, Pope Francis isn't doing anything radical. Rather, he is building on decades of papal precedent that began with St. John Paul II's declaration in 1990 that the greenhouse effect has now reached crisis proportions as a consequence of industrial growth, massive urban concentrations, and vastly increased energy needs. By calling for prudence, the Church calls for policies guided by the best available science. The unequivocal standard of this science is the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. The IPCC calculates that humans have already warmed the planet 1.1 degrees Celsius, or 2 degrees Fahrenheit, since the Industrial Revolution. The IPCC also warns that warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, risks climate change that is effectively runaway and irreversible. To have at least a 50% chance to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which at this point will be nearly impossible, the world must meet 3 benchmarks. We must peak global greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, cut these emissions in roughly half by 2030, and reach net zero carbon by about 2050. Here, it's important to emphasize that net zero requires reducing direct emissions 90% before turning to offsets like tree planting. So we've established that prudent action on behalf of climate social justice is essential to the Church's mission. We've also identified what prudent climate policies entail. At this point, we can recognize that these science-based policies not only apply to secular society, but to the Church itself. Recall that the Church's mission is to proclaim and to spread among all peoples the kingdom of Christ and of God, and to be on earth the initial budding forth of that kingdom. In other words, the Church must embody the kingdom it proclaims. This, as we saw, entails social justice through advocacy that works to reform any social structure, including the Church. Put differently, the Church must pursue prudent internal climate social justice through policies to decarbonize in line with the best available science. Here, we can go even further and recognize that this work is not only a matter of mission fidelity, but also of the Church's credibility. In the 1971 World Synod of Bishops document, Justitia in Mundo, the bishops write, "For unless the Christian message of love and justice shows its effectiveness through action in the cause of justice in the world, it will only with difficulty gain credibility with the people of our time." Similarly, the bishops stress that the Church is obliged to live and administer its own goods in such a way that the gospel is proclaimed to the poor. If instead the Church appears to be among the rich and the powerful of this world, its credibility is diminished. Here, this diminished credibility directly applies to youth and young adults. In February of 2021, 2 of my students, Emily Burke and Henry Glynn, had the extraordinary chance to speak with Pope Francis about climate change. Summarizing their remarks in a story published in National Catholic Reporter, they wrote, "Young people value authenticity and deplore hypocrisy. We told Pope Francis that U.S. Catholic leaders' failure to share and enact the Church's own climate teachings is causing many in our generation to become disillusioned with the Church. So in terms of both credibility and fidelity, we can now say that prudent internal action on behalf of climate social justice is essential to the Church's mission." At this point, we can move to the second item about diocesan commitments to decarbonization. This action is a particular responsibility of bishops. Notice that in Justitia in Mundo, the bishops stress that the Church is obliged to live and administer its own goods in ways that embody Church teaching. Although the Church is the people of God, this ecclesial administrative responsibility is one of the 3 episcopal offices, the offices to which each bishop is ordained. As the Second Vatican Council document Christus Dominus describes, each bishop is ordained to the offices of teaching, sanctifying, and governing, in other words, of administering their diocese in accord with the Church's mission. Since this mission, as we've seen, essentially entails prudent internal action on behalf of climate social justice, This means that each bishop has an episcopal duty to govern or administer their diocese through prudent internal climate social guided by the Intergovernmental Panel. Bishop has a responsibility to enact policies that commit all diocesan-owned facilities and operations to the 3 identified benchmarks: to peak greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, to cut greenhouse gas emissions in roughly half by 2030, and to reach net zero carbon by 2050. So to summarize, we can now say that prudent internal action on behalf of climate social justice is essential to the Church's mission and a particular responsibility of bishops. It's a matter of episcopal fidelity. And here we can also recognize that Pope Francis is leading by example. As the local bishop of Rome, the Pope has committed the Vatican to be net zero carbon by 2050. In other words, he has modeled what is required of all other local bishops. Finally, we can move to the third point that diocesan commitments to decarbonization are a unique opportunity for the Church. Again, we've established that prudent internal climate action on behalf of climate social justice is essential to the Church's mission and a particular responsibility of bishops. It's a matter of episcopal fidelity. If bishops were to fulfill this responsibility, they would first of all have a unique opportunity to catalyze external social justice. Recall that the U.S. Catholic Church owns more than 100,000 buildings. This is an extraordinary scale of operation. This also means that U.S. Catholic commitments to science-based targets to peak greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, to cut emissions in roughly half by 2030, and to be net zero carbon by 2040 would force civil society, utilities, governments, etc., to meet the demand by reforming systems, structures, and policies. In other words, if the Church simply lives its own teaching, it can catalyze external social justice. Put differently, the Church's infidelity to its own mission is squandering extraordinary potential to be, as the Catechism describes, leaven in the world. In addition to providing an opportunity to catalyze external social justice, diocesan commitments to decarbonization are an incredible opportunity to catalyze the new evangelization among youth and young adults. We know that young people have tremendous anxiety about the climate crisis. A groundbreaking study from the medical journal The Lancet found that among youth and young adults in 10 countries, 59% were very or extremely worried about climate change. More than half reported each of the following emotions: sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. We also know that globally, young people prioritize climate change more than any other issue. A study from Amnesty International found that Generation Z globally identifies climate change as the most important social issue. At the same time, we know that young people are leaving organized religion generally, and the Catholic Church in particular. This is exhaustively documented, among other places, in the report Going, Going, Gone: The Dynamics of Disaffiliation in Young Catholics. And amidst this disaffiliation, we know that young people are frustrated by the Church's refusal to live its own teaching on climate change. Once again, as Emily Burke and Henry Glynn describe, young people value authenticity and deplore hypocrisy. We told Pope Francis that U.S. Catholic leaders' failure to share and enact the Church's own climate teachings is causing many in our generation to become disillusioned with the Church. At the crossroads of all these dynamics, the Church has an incredible opportunity. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops describes the new evangelization as new in its methods that must correspond to the signs of the times. We recognize the signs of the times as young people leaving the Church and desperately concerned about the climate crisis. When we recognize this, we can see that diocesan commitment to decarbonization is an evangelical opportunity that is, as the bishops describe, new in its methods that correspond to the times. This is especially so when we recall that evangelization requires credible action that lives what the Church teaches. That as the Church defines it, evangelization is the announcing of Christ by a living testimony as well as by spoken word. So to conclude, we can look at the top of this slide and we can recognize that prudent internal action on behalf of climate social justice is essential to the church's mission and a particular responsibility of bishops. It's a matter of episcopal fidelity. And to this, we can now add that bishops' diocesan commitments to peak greenhouse gases by 2025, cut greenhouse gas emissions in roughly half by 2030, and be net zero carbon by 2040 are an opportunity to catalyze external social justice and offer living testimony through the new evangelization that engages youth and young adults who are deeply concerned about the climate crisis. In summary, then, the Church, and especially our bishops, has extraordinary responsibilities and opportunities to commit all diocesan-owned facilities and operations to science-based greenhouse gas reduction. For the rest of the Church, as the people of God, we have a tremendous responsibility and opportunity to advocate for these faith-based commitments. I look forward to the discussion about all this tonight, and I'm now excited to hear from Dr. Martinez and Deacon Ferris.
Right. Now, Deacon Kent, you can take it away.
Thank you, Kayla. Waiting for one moment from my colleague Paz. I serve as Director of Social Action and Catholic Charities for the Diocese of Davenport, a position I've held since 2009. My responsibilities include ministry concerning social, economic, and environmental justice, and also Respect Life efforts. I attended the Laudato Si conference at Creighton in 2019 and the virtual conference in 2021. The diocese enrolled in the Laudato Si platform on November 14th of 2021, and we registered our action plan on October 4th last year. The Catholic Climate Covenant and Creighton University and Dan DeLeo have been invaluable friends in what one trusted colleague has said is the most important church undertaking in the next 20 years. Next slide. With the help of the Catholic Climate Covenant, in turn, Catholic Energies and Virtus Group, we undertook an energy audit of chancery operations from November through January of this year. Much of what I will share in my time is what we learned from the audit. Next. To undertake our energy audit, Liesl Schwartz needed hard data on our energy consumption. It's always good to have a colleague like Rich Hatfield here at the diocese who knows the data. He probably got it to Liesl faster than most other clients. These past few years have also afforded us the opportunity to do compare and contrast review of our energy consumption from pre-pandemic to the midst of the pandemic when all worked remotely, to being back in the building again, and now with the building being closed on Fridays and workers having the flexibility of working from home one other day of the week. Next. During the audit, what was measured were greenhouse gas emissions that are Scope 1 and Scope 2, the direct emissions from sources on site or emissions from utilities. I'll reference rural conversations later, but let me note that farmers are very aware of Scope 3 indirect emissions. Just as we need to know our energy consumption numbers, farmers are being encouraged to know, to own theirs. By way of the Inflation Reduction Act, the 2024 corn crops, for example, may see financial gain for farmers come January 1st of 2025. The carbon intensity score per bushel will be valuable to the corporations who buy the corn and in turn to use it for ethanol as an example. Financial gain from IRA will be realized. The farmers with better carbon intensity scores for their crops could then also claim a portion of what the corporations stand to gain. Next. This is in turn our numbers: 134 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, for a building that is well over 100 years old. This is our chancery, the diocesan administrative offices, but also the location for retired priests in residence. And so we start here. Next. Liesl and her colleagues helped us appreciate the carbonization process in light of See, Judge, and Act. Step 1, complete a greenhouse gas inventory to account for all emissions emitted by your organization. Step 2, understand the levers that you have to reduce your emissions and decide what is the best climate goal and timeline for your organization. 3, organize the implementation of the selected strategies and track the progress toward your goals. Next. In order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, Virtus provided us with 2 estimates on cost of solar, one involving just one building, the other that would include more buildings. Those of you that have had audits done with this level of detail know that Google Map images are used based on latitude, reach of shade, based on existing trees and other factors. Besides estimated cost and carbon offset, the report also shows estimated payback period. Next. And here's the visual with multiple buildings being used for the proposed solar part of our project. And next. This graph provided by Liesl at Virtus is titled All In with Grid Decarbonization. If you are a customer of a utility company that is still operating coal-fired plants, you're going to run up against the reality that if they delay in retiring those plants, you and we will never reach or achieve net zero. This is our reality in that the utility company continues to operate not only one, but 2 such plants. We aren't the only organization locally that is in this dilemma. One of the largest public school districts in the diocese is attempting to also achieve net zero. Grid decarbonization will bring us together with other neighbors. Next. Though these aren't the precise refined goals for our diocesan action plan, Virtus has provided us with a number of very specific goals to consider. Based on our self-imposed deadlines, we will have the refined goals on a path to net zero to share with the people of the diocese on October 4. As a point of clarification, REC references a renewable energy certificate, and REC is created for every megawatt hour of electricity generated and delivered to the grid from a renewable energy source, and they will indeed be part of our plan. Next. As Dan and others have noted, Christina Figueres, former executive secretary of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change and opening keynote speaker for this summer conference, challenged the global church to be net zero by 2040. Based on this graph, we would at least have chancery operations there by 2040. I don't want to overstate the accomplishment that this will be. Achieving net zero for but one part of the total diocesan operations will not be everything, but it is not insignificant. The lessons we will learn as we undertake this project, the many people with technical expertise and moral passion from here in the diocese who will help us, all of this will catapult the project from something too expensive, too complex, to something that is manageable, taken 1 year, one segment at a time. Next. I do want to spend some of my time talking about some of the other elements of our action plan. Next. In addition to working towards net zero by 2050 for chancery operations, our Laudato Si action plan includes praying, learning, and action goals. Catholic Relief Services, the U.S. Bishop's response to the need of the world's poor in over 100 countries, helps us hear the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. They hear it, they see it from those they serve, from the created world that our brothers and sisters so depend on. Despite contributing the least to climate change, communities affected by poverty are also the ones most harmed by its impact. As Pope Francis notes in Laudato Si, those living in poverty are also often the ones most likely to find themselves needing to move to continue to provide for their family. CRS stresses that we must work together to protect our planet and global family so that our brothers and sisters don't merely survive, but thrive. We highlight the work of CRS during each season of creation in order that we understand that our voices, talents, gifts, prayers, and support can help in our care for creation and work towards ending global poverty. In the words of CRS, this is our moment, and such a movement can build a world that benefits all people and upholds human dignity, stressing that our planet and global family depend on it. This particular photo is one from CRS and efforts in Honduras, and the detail of cover crops does not escape my Midwest eyes. The fundamentals of caring for creation really is a global language. Back a slide, I also list IPL for those of you not familiar with the acronym that stands for Interfaith Power and Light. I help the bishop's office with matters relating to ecumenical and interreligious affairs. Pope Francis addressed Laudato Si to every person living on this planet. The season of creation is a special season of ecumenical solidarity. When we celebrate the season of creation, when we care for creation, we realize that we are being called to do so with people from the church, with those from other faith traditions, and with all people of goodwill. Next. 2 years ago, I began work on a capstone project as part of graduate studies in pastoral theology. My faculty advisor, the primary review reader of my paper, is a world-renowned scholar on St. Ambrose of Milan, and is also a moral theologian who specializes in environmental ethics. Father Robert Budd Grant speaks regularly on the campus of St. Ambrose University, in parish halls, and to interfaith groups, has done so for many years. Even before beginning formal degree studies, I attended all of his lectures and presentations. His involvement with care for creation includes a pivotal moment when he heard Pope St. John Paul II give a homily at Living History Farms in Des Moines on the Feast of St. Francis, 1979, while serving on the altar as an acolyte. If you've never read the homily, I encourage you to do so. It is available via the Vatican website. If or when there is ever a new version of the Compendium of Social Doctrine of the Church, I hope the homily is referenced. We here in Iowa might be a bit biased, but I think it's important because of how it shows advancing thought on care for creation over the past 3 most recent papacies. To give you a sense of the power of that Mass, Father Budd refers to the homily as the birth of environmental theology, and in a printed reflection wrote, "Faith isn't that we can escape crucifixion, but trust that we can pass through it. Hope is that creative disruption precedes resurrection. Love means redistributing the world's suffering onto our own shoulders as stewards of a gift from God, which is intended for the good of all humanity." I approached the writing of a degree paper while also assisting Bishop's office with enrolling in the Laudato Si platform. In classes, Father Budd would comment that I tend to go down too many rabbit holes, and his recommendation was that I narrow a project to something more specific than merely a proposed diocesan-level Laudato Si action plan. The repeated narrowing of topics or theses resulted in a focus on rural conversations within our Laudato Si action plan. When I first started working for our diocese, I believed that the most contentious life issue I would need to be aware of, beginning with the letter A, would be abortion. And though that may still be the case, agriculture is at least a very close second. Those who raise livestock and have crops in the field do so in order to provide food for themselves and their family, as well as for neighbors close and far away. Ag is big in Iowa, a state of 3 million people and 23 million hogs, a land with 12 million acres of corn and 10 million of soybeans. Agriculture becomes contentious when farmers feel like they are being told what to do by people who don't know farming. So my proposal for specific rural conversations about care for creation, as well as those actual conversations themselves within our plan, has been to undertake them with a great sense of humility and a willingness to listen. The deep connection between faith and rural life came into great focus for me during early conversations when I heard Bishop Zinkula say to a group of rural ecumenical clergy that he never felt closer to God's creation than when he did chores as a young boy on his family's farm. A friend who farms here in Iowa, Matt Russell, is quoted by Catherine Hayhoe in her book as saying that as it relates to caring for creation, and in light of changes that are occurring in the world around us, that it is farmers and rural Americans that understand the challenges. They are the ones who are going to solve this. What Matt describes, this deep understanding of the land and the deep faith of those with such knowledge, is what is at the heart of identifying a specific action plan goal of having rural conversations. Hayhoe cites a project drawdown estimate that conservation agriculture could sequester a year's worth of the entire world's carbon emissions and save farmers somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion in lifetime operational costs. As it relates to care for creation and the genius of those actively living their Catholic faith in rural communities, my advice is to first go and merely listen. Listen for ag field days, ones that talk about soil health and carbon sequestration. Go and listen and take copious notes and prepare to have your mind blown. And then stay in contact. Avail yourselves of subsequent conversations where the next 5 or 10 years are discussed. The importance for farmers to know and own their data. How a carrot rather than a stick approach to the monetization of carbon capture will not only help operations' bottom lines, but will enable them to go from 6th to 7th generation farmers. I can appreciate that not all of you have folks in your diocese that have been identified by Forbes magazine as one of the top 30 under 30, the brightest of rising stars for development of sustainable ag models. But you absolutely have smart, knowledgeable folks firmly planted in their rural communities who care deeply about creation and know what it's going to take to do right in responding to the cry of the earth. And lastly, as it relates to rural conversations, know that Jim Ennis, Tim Streef, and the good folks at Catholic Rural Life have great resources for rural conversations like the vocation of the agricultural leader, a resource that references Laudato Si and other church documents. CRL also provides support in creating and maintaining Catholic Rural Life chapters, similar to the type of support PAWS at the Catholic Climate Covenant does for those undertaking action plan efforts from their sector. Next. Here at the Chancery, we share the back drive with the Sisters of the Congregation of the Humility of Mary. Across the front lane and back property line, we have St. Ambrose University and Assumption High School as neighbors as well. Last week, when Dan, Craig from Virtus, and the sisters next door and I were Zooming, we were all comparing notes. I mentioned that we have regular conversations with St. Ambrose University's Sustainability Committee, along with sharing notes with the good sisters. Sister Lynn, or maybe Sister Marcia, asked Kent, wouldn't it be good for us to get all 4 of our groups together and look at plans? Have you talked with Assumption yet? To which I replied, as I have done in other conversations regarding an ever-developing action plan, not yet. There is no better way to be held accountable for a goal than to share it with another, and accountability comes to a higher level yet when disclosing it in a national conference presentation. Next. I might not be using all of my allotted 20 minutes, but I want to stop here with this image and sharing a confession of sorts. My wife and I have been secular Franciscans for over 30 years. She's much smarter than I am at a lot of things. I'm quite sure she's understood the Canticle of the Creatures as St. Francis first expressed it. But I will tell you that it's only in the past couple of years that I have read and understood his words correctly. See, in my mind, I process it as, praise be you, my Lord, for Sister Moon, Brother Wind, Sister Water. It is rather, praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon, Brother Wind, Sister Water, Brother Fire, Sister Mother Earth. I aspire to have a Francis-like appreciation for seeing the created world as the statue of Francis overlooking San Damiano, worshiping God through creation while appreciating the familial relationships with each part of creation as well. As such, caring for creation takes on a deeply spiritual significance for me. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our speakers. We will now open it up for a Q&A. Everybody did such a great job. The first question that I have, as I was listening to what you were saying and also like kind of filtering through all of the amazing resources you shared, it seems a little overwhelming, but I just want to know where the two of you find hope in all of this.
You can go first, Carlos.
Okay, yes, the scientist finding hope. No, I do think there are several areas where I find solace in. The first that I always hold with is that the world has experienced an international problem similar to this before and resolved it, and that was the ozone hole. So for those of you out there who don't know about the ozone hole, the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons that were emitted from refrigeration back in the 70s, 60s, whatever, and hairspray, that caused a hole in the ozone layer. And you can still kind of see it in satellite imageries from NASA in the Antarctic, because that's where it is. Alarm bells rang, and there was international cooperation, and they banned chlorofluorocarbons. And as a result, the ozone hole will be returned back to normal. There will be no more hole by the 2050s, 2060s as a result of that policy change. And so that gives me hope because there has been international collaboration, policymaking, that was not politicized and did the right thing for our planet. And I hope the same for this too. And I also have hope with the work that I have been fortunate to do within Cosmos and seeing the receptivity of scientists and faith leaders working together. Because there has always been, unfortunately, this taboo that because we have different ways of knowing and understanding the world, we can't work together. Well, in a planet where we all live in one home, we have to. This will take a village, and it has to take everyone, including folks who you may not agree with, including folks who may not have a similar belief system as you. And we see that in Scripture. We saw that with Christ, who welcomed everyone, including the Gentiles, the Israelites, every human being. And so I have hope there too, because I think given the urgency of the issue at hand, there is more receptivity and awareness that this is not a political issue. This is a moral issue. This is a cosmic ethical issue, and it's a personal issue. And from that, we can do real change as with what we have already done in the past with other global issues.
I've got two matters of hope. One deals with the action platform itself. I think it was inspired genius to have different sectors. What I hear from other dioceses, some of whom have their bishop on board and have the support and are a half step behind us as far as developing a plan. But I also hear from friends in other parts of the country, and their diocese has not yet committed to early steps. The reason that I mention the platform is because of the other sectors. So in addition to parish and diocese being one of them, you also have Catholic higher ed institutions, you have religious orders, you have hospitals, Catholic hospitals. And so even if it's the case that the origin doesn't come from the diocese proper, the diocese needs to be aware of Catholic institutions who are talking amongst themselves in the same way that we're trying to do with a high school and a university, and begin to talk and compare notes. What is it within our means? What kind of steps can we take in order to encourage each other to move? And then I think that we may find that some dioceses say, you know, it's within our reach as well. The other thing that I would say is, if you are intending to have these types of conversations and kind of formalize some type of effort, identify for yourself an official or unofficial spiritual director who can keep you in tune with our responsibility as people of faith to maintain hope, and also allow for the space of the movement of the Holy Spirit, because otherwise you will very quickly become so overwhelmed with all of the reports that you find that it's in paralysis, and that is not, despair is not allowed as people of faith.
Awesome. Yes. God bless spiritual directors. Thank God for them. This question is for Dr. Martinez. It was asked by Dylan. So what would you say are the 3 most impactful changes an American or a family can make in order to mitigate climate change and lower emissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I saw several of the questions are really awesome. So thank you for that one, Dylan. The first one is talk about it. A recent poll, 37% of Americans only occasionally talk about climate change or environmentalism. Talking about it will drive the cultural changes, the political changes that are needed to be had to deal with the effects of climate in the United States and around the world. But also, when I mean by talking about it, share your story, personalize the issue. Graphs and charts, oftentimes they don't go as far as sharing how, a hurricane, wildfire, these climate induced impacts on communities have had an impact in your families, in your livelihoods. I think that really connects with folks a lot more, in addition to the graphs and charts. I think another big area is the development of healthy consumption practices. America is big on consumption, relatively speaking to other countries around the world. So thinking about, food practices and consumption with respect to electricity, are there greener ways to more eco-friendly ways with respect to public transportation usage, with making your building greener in any capacity, with food as well. I think all of those help. And then especially with the Catholic community, and I saw some of the comments too, at least in the United States, there's so much more that our community can be doing. As I have seen the impacts of other faith-based communities are working very diligently on with this issue. I think really, really, really advocacy work, work with your local politicians, the decision makers that oftentimes are the ones that drive what emission standards are out there, what eco-green policies will be had, I think is really, really, really important. And you may think that, just doing it once is okay. Well, just be consistent, be persistent. I mean, we Catholics, we do that in other issues. We can do the same with this as well.
That does lead us to a question that came up many times in the chat, and maybe Deacon Kent, you can start us off with this, but Dr. Martinez, feel free to also chime in on it. But the big question that we always are asked is, how do we move our church? How do we get them to take action? So Deacon Kent, maybe you could share a little bit more about your experience and how you convinced your diocese to take these steps, and then any recommendations you might be able to give to other people.
It's always hard to compare what one has as far as support in the diocese. I'm blessed, right? So our diocese was doing 3 things at once. We were doing synod, Eucharistic revival, and this, and have synergy committee meetings as a result of it. But what I would say is, wherever you are, figure out what the next challenge really becomes. And I hearken back to the words of Father Grant talking about redistributive suffering. we really need to, to echo Carlos, we really need to begin to look at what sort of suffering and sacrifice we make. As a Franciscan, I've never been to a CC. And in 2025, there is to be a major gathering in a CC. If you live close to a CC and you can make it, great. But maybe what I'm being called to do is make a CC in Muscatine, Iowa, as opposed to jet setting to a CC to be part of an event holding up care for creation and while contributing to it. And so us in the United States have to take serious stock in what we're doing and what's within our means to be doing. And we consume, as Carlos is saying. So there's the combination of both. You look for allies, you figure out what's possible for the next step, but don't get comfortable just because your bishop in this moment happens to be supportive of it. Gain momentum from sector neighbors in order to have it be something that itself is sustainable.
Great. Carla,
Yeah, I was going to say, I echo everything that you just said, Deacon Paris. I think it's really important that there is unity from the entire church, local diocese, your bishops, etc., to find ways and means to work together when it comes to these issues. Not every local community is the same. There are different regional impacts, as I shared, in different parts of the United States. And so different churches, different dioceses will have to respond differently to them. They have to be tailored in a way that is focused on the issues at hand in those given areas. I think it's really important that we connect the, science as a guide to help in that persuasion, in that decision-making process, that there is unity and collaboration. And I also think mental health is really important here, because this can be very draining for a lot of us, to give us space and time to reinvigorate ourselves, to remotivate ourselves. When we think about the future generations that will live here, when we think about creation as a whole, I think the Laudato Si platform has a really brilliant way of us grounding ourselves into what this mission is, so that when we need to refuel ourselves spiritually and in these actions that we hope to do as a community, we can do so.
awesome. Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more. This is a pretty practical question. Christina from San Diego asked you, Deacon Kent, what net zero pathway scope level did Davenport choose?
San Diego, which is like light years ahead of us, not only because of the state that they live in and the regulations that they have. The answer is we haven't determined them yet. The reality of it is we don't have the means of going electric by 2030 based on the recharging stations for vehicles. But I do believe that we're hybrid from here out. And then we're watching closely and asking for the type of support by way of communities to move towards electric. What we found in the short period of time since Liesl finished her work is it's quite likely that ground source heat pumps may actually move ahead of solar as far as the time frame for what part we do next, because of additional breaks that come by way of utilizing that energy reduction method. But we've also got, again, like I say, we've got literal neighbors that we need to get in conversations with, because if we're digging wells, if neighbors can share the cost of those, then all of a sudden that project gets a lot more accessible. So stay tuned, because we've set a pretty ambitious matter. October 4, we've got to have mid-project goals. And so let the clock begin.
Great. And then I can answer this next question, but we had a lot of people asking about all of the amazing resources that you sent. And so, yes, the covenant will provide you with all of the great resources, as well as the recording of this session. I think it is about time to start wrapping up. So I'm going to share my screen. And again, thank you, Deacon Kent and Dr. Martinez, for being here and sharing your wisdom. Just give me one moment, everybody.
Very quickly, Kayla, I do want to thank Liesl, who was on standby, so that if I took this off the course, she could put it back on. So I'm assuming we didn't hear from Liesl, which means I did okay. Thank you, Liesl.
You did a great job.
Oops. Okie doke. So this was actually our last webinar of this series, but we invite all of you to join us on this upcoming Thursday, which is July 27th, for our closing award ceremony. We will be giving awards to various people across the country and organizations that are our Laudato Si champions. That session starts at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and feel free to join us and to celebrate with us. And now we will end with a closing prayer from Saint Hildegard. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Every creature is a glistening, glittering mirror of divinity. Oh, beloved, your way of knowing is amazing. The way you recognize every creature, even before it appears. The way you gaze into the face of every human being and see all your works gazing back at you. Oh, what a miracle to be awake inside your breathing. Amen. And Saint Hildegard, pray for us. Again, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to our amazing panelists, and I hope you all have a great evening.